Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a political podcast that isn't famous enough to get Nate Silver on. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah. It's had a very moving Remembrance Day today, but I think we'll touch on that later. How's your weekend been? I hear you had a late night.
Yeah, very late night, singing lots of karaoke, singing Rocket Man. I rapped the rap from My Humps by the Black Eyed Peas, which is a party piece of mine. I do actually know all the words to that song. It's very depressing. So how did you spend your time in between episodes? I heard that you had a brush with sort of political royalty, as it were.
Yes, I have stood mere meters from the man, the legend himself, John Burko, who he's our unofficial mascot, I suppose, seeing as he's in the logo for the show. He did all the big numbers. He said order when he was supposed to. It was very good. This is a question time style event organised by Wycombe School. So one of our listeners, his girlfriend is a teacher there, and there was this event arranged by the students there. It was very good, really. So they had it was two panels, one after the other. So the first panel was students from local schools all kind of putting on a particular role, a bit like Model United Nations. So there was one guy who was like probably the most in character of them. Like he was playing this libertarian character and got like actual boos from the audience because he was like completely full on down that like edge of YouTube kind of rabbit hole. And that was hosted by one of the teachers, and they went back and forth over various issues. It was a good bit of murmuring from the audience, a bit like we were in the actual chamber of Parliament. And then, the main thing was we had John Burko hosting, and then they had the local MP, a local Lib Dem councillor, the deputy head of the Green Party, and I've forgotten his name, but there's an economist who writes for the Telegraph. So, a range of views. The MP, you'll know his name better than I will probably. He quit the Brexit department over stuff May was doing, I think.
Okay. Was he remain or leave before? Did he make his views clear on that point? Or
I think he was leave, but like he was kind of a sensible view to leave. Like his arguments were very, he'd looked into like how WTO rules work and things like that. So he had opinions on them, but like he doesn't like the idea of a no deal kind of just drop out kind of thing. But I think he also was against the kind of closer knit, mostly EU kind of deal that seemed to be what the government was going for. I think that was his opinion anyway.
Yeah. And was the topic of discussion, was it mostly Brexit, or were there sort of more like student focused questions? Did they focus on education, or was there anything particular about the questions that were asked to the panel?
No, I think that was a good mix. And obviously Burko did a good job of stopping people going off on rants about Brexit when it wasn't the main point of the question. There were a few Brexit questions, obviously, because that's what people are worried about right now. But there were questions about allowing children to vote, 16-year-olds and up, that they can get married at 16. Why can't they vote? That kind of argument. And there were some other discussions, other questions about, talking about how Trump's affecting things, which I suppose we'll get on to later when we talk about the midterms. It was a varied discussion, and it was very well done. It was very civil in a way that like even TV question time can often get a bit partisan. There was a lot more, I think there was a lot of talking about, often you jump to conclusions based on a person's opinion about a particular topic. So, for example, they have an economist there from the Telegraph. You assume he's going to be quite right-wing in some of his views, but he often was agreeing with the woman from the Green Party. So, there was, I think, it was a good debate in that it showed you how a good debate should be run, where there wasn't name calling, there wasn't ad hominem attacks and stuff like that. It was discussion of the issues, and people may have disagreed on those issues, but they made their points clearly and succinctly. And in general, it was an actual nice political discussion, which I feel is something we're probably missing a bit nowadays in a lot of the stuff we see on TV and YouTube and so on. So that was nice.
No, that sounds excellent. I mean, I've never had the chance to go to Parliament myself or watch anything like that. So just getting that little bit of Parliament sort of like in your school environment must have been really excited. And I hope the students like took a lot away from it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, they seem to have arranged it all themselves. The teachers were very, they came to me with this idea. I was like, that's never going to work, and then it did. So I think it shows what you can get done when there's a will, there's a way. But yeah, it's very impressive that and it's also great to see people getting engaged at such a young age. I mean, we're talking A-level students doing the actual organising, but then there were lots of students there like helping with tea and coffee, etc. So there are people who have turned up for the evening because they were interested, and I think that's great.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah. We'll bung a photo in the show notes of the panel that was sent to us by the school. So we'll put that in there. Right. So shall we move on to headline quickfire?
Let's do it.
Yeah, we'll do slightly shortened this week because I think we've got a lot to talk about later. So first, in the Financial Times, Hammond to put Brexit at heart of budget that retreats from austerity.
Yeah, this was the news that broke just after our last podcast, which was the outcome of the budget that ran in the UK. Philip Hammond, there was talk before the budget that it might be one that it's the first one that's really going to have to take into account the impact of Brexit if there is a no deal or not. To put Brexit at the heart of the budget, Hammond sort of went on the assumption that we are getting a deal, and in doing so said that we would have to move away from the period of austerity, which has dominated our politics ever since 2010, since David Cameron and George Osborne got in charge, and they decided that the best way to control the country's finances was to make sure that we reduced public spending. It seemed like a good idea at the time, or at least was, an idea that ultimately won them the election. However, it's been deeply unpopular as time has gone on, as public services have been squeezed and people essentially can't get the same sort of level of service or quality that they had before the crash. It's one of the biggest issues that the Conservatives have had, and it's one of the biggest issues, like the differences between the two parties in the 2017 general election. The Conservatives are often heard saying, like, there isn't a magic money tree. We can't afford to spend these things. We are the party of the sensible financial spending, while Labour would just spend money on anything. But I think the results of the 2017 election prove that public opinion has shifted to no, we don't want austerity anymore. We need to put money back into our public services to fund them. And this is the Conservatives reacting to this. I think on the day, many people seem to accept it as like, oh, okay, if austerity's over, that sounds good. And, there would be a lot of, vote winners in here for the Conservatives. But I feel that the day after, the papers and a lot of commentators looked at it a bit more closely and said, they say austerity is over, but one, I don't know how they're going to fund it, and two, the money that they're putting in doesn't really seem to match this claim that austerity is over. Did you hear the claim about the Hammond saying that schools would have money to buy little extras?
Yes, I mean it's hard to be on Facebook with knowing people who are teachers and not have seen the furor over this. So yeah.
Yeah, that was, many teachers found it insulting. They said, like, we don't need money for little extras. We need money for, textbooks, actual, like, the basics to teach our children. So, in short, a mixed response to that budget. I don't think it's probably the slam dunk that Theresa May or Philip Hammond were hoping for, but it at least marks a bit of a sea change in British politics. I think the austerity George Osborne days are certainly over, and people realise now that there is a real need to at least increase public spending in the short term.
We'll move on to our next headline now. From The Observer, Aaron Banks faces new claims of misleading MPs over Brexit.
This is the news that Aaron Banks, the sort of controversial financier for the Leave.eu campaign, is now being investigated by the National Crime Agency for alleged misdemeanors around the source of the finance that he got to fund some of the advertising he did during the referendum. Mr. Banks has claimed that there's nothing to worry about. It's all generated by his own insurance companies, which he runs in the UK. However, some seem to think that there's some dodgy points in that. I think the Financial Times brought up the point that Rock Holdings, the company where he said generated stuff, is actually just a holding company. And the alleged thing that's going on here is that people think that Russia or an outside source may have provided the funds for Leave.eu to put out their controversial advertising, their controversial campaign messages during the referendum, and when there was such a narrow result, those sort of messages could have swung it in favour of Leave. In short, I don't think this is going to change the result of Brexit. It's certainly not going to reverse it, in my opinion. But again, it's another thing that makes you frustrated about the way that the Brexit campaign was handled, and particularly if a foreign power, if there have been foreign donations and they've been used to fund a campaign that just affected the UK, that doesn't bode well for our democracy or how our democracy works. So the fact that this is being investigated by the National Crime Agency, which is sort of the equivalent of our FBI, I would guess, over in the UK, like one of the highest sort of like levels of investigation you can have in the UK. It's a big deal. I don't know what you thought of the claims themselves.
So I think it's kind of part of the problem here is the rhetoric around it is obviously very it's very partisan because it's on Brexit. So you have people being like, this we can strike, Brexit must stop because of this thing, and it's like, sadly, that's not going to happen. We're not going to change the outcome because of this. And I think it's also because Leave.eu wasn't the official campaign as well. So there's, yes, it will have had an impact. And I think with a vote this close, that impact should not be ignored. And if he's done something wrong, he should definitely be investigated and, dealt with in whatever I feel more than a slap on the wrist would be good. He's clearly a man who can fund an entire political campaign. So therefore a small fine probably wouldn't be enough for him. But I think it's kind of the problem. There's a lot of this stuff kind of going on around the sides on the Leave side. And I think, how to describe this really? I suppose it feels like the campaign was fought more fairly from the Remain side, which is also my side. And it's hard to disentangle the fact that it feels like the other side were cheating from, if it didn't feel like that at the time, we felt like, okay, they did win fair and square, even though we don't agree with it. Now it feels like, oh, well, this little thing happened and this little thing happened. And it's kind of like, none of those little things is enough to be like, well, you were fully cheating, stop Brexit now. But it's also...
They add up, don't they?
Yeah, they add up. And it's like, it's irritating that the other side wasn't playing fairly, especially when it was such a close vote. And we can't go back in time and see what would have... You can't run that vote again and see what the result would have been if that hadn't happened. Obviously, we can infer that maybe less people would have voted for leaving the EU, which, it just doesn't fill you with hope for the political system, I suppose. It's kind of generally anything that undermines the political system in any way is not great.
Yeah. And I hope that if this is, proven to be true, that the consequences for Arron Banks are, severe, at least, makes people think twice before accepting foreign donations or doing this in any other election in the future. Because, it certainly doesn't bode well for our democracy working the way it should do if this is allowed to happen.
I suppose, still staying on the topic of Brexit, our next headline from The Guardian: blow for May as another Johnson quits over Brexit.
Yes, this is the news that Boris Johnson's brother, Joe Johnson, has quit the cabinet, and in doing so, he called for a new vote, basically a second vote, like the one we were talking about last week. He quit, essentially saying that the Brexit deal that was being negotiated wasn't what anyone had voted for. It might be worth pointing out at this stage that Joe Johnson originally voted Remain, so he's very different in that respect from his brother. But some of the rhetoric coming out of his resignation sort of put quite a harsh light on the way that those who know what's happening in Brexit most closely, i.e. the cabinet, they're the ones getting all the inside briefings, how they really feel about what's going on. And it appears that they think that Theresa May's putting on a brave face, where actually she's not going to be able to return anything that either Remain or Leavers would really want. I think Joe Johnson said in his own words that this was a failure of British statecraft unseen since the Suez Crisis. That a that even a no-deal Brexit may well be better than a never-ending purgatory. So in that respect, he's talking about this backstop idea. Do you know about the backstop and how it would work?
I'm not sure I'm fully up to date on it. The backstop is the idea that there would be, if everything, instead of not having a no deal, it's like if everything goes wrong, we do this, this, and this. Yes.
Yeah, you essentially, to put it in layman's terms, you kick the can down the road. You say, we are going to do a deal sometime, but because we can't agree a deal over Northern Ireland, we'll keep the EU rules in place until we sort that out. And so what he's saying there is that, this could never ever get sorted out, and we're just always in the process of endless negotiations. This could go on for years and years and years past Article 50. There's no clean cut. Yes, he finally added that inflicting such serious economic and political harm on the country will leave an indelible impression of incompetence in the minds of the public, and that the democratic thing to do is to give the public the final say. Essentially, he's saying that Theresa May has really ballsed this up, and that if she was to mess this up, then everybody's going to be unhappy. Remainers are going to be unhappy, Leavers are going to be unhappy, and that will do such damage to the political system and the public's belief that, politicians are the best people to make these type of decisions, that we would need a second vote to at least have some sort of definitive democratic stamp on the Brexit process. Because at the moment, nobody's going to get what they want.
So moving on to, I suppose, it's Sunday today as we record. In the Mail on Sunday, their headline was 100 years to the day, a nation bows its head. So today is the 11th of November, and that means it's Armistice Day, but also it's a special one this year because it's 100 years since the end of World War One. Did you have anything to add on that? I suppose we're just kind of mentioning it.
I think it might be worth mentioning what Trump did over the weekend. On Saturday, the day before the armistice ceremonies, Trump was meant to go to an American war cemetery in France. Instead, he declined because it was slightly drizzly. He said it was bad weather, but when you looked at the weather, it was only mildly spitting. This caused quite an outcry on Twitter and from other world leaders, most notably Justin Trudeau, who made a point during his speech at the Canadian cemetery to take away his umbrella, and saying that, it's worth reminding. It said something on the lines of, it's worth us reminding ourselves that while we're here getting wet and our suits are getting wet, that 100 years ago it was a hail of bullets, it wasn't a hail of water. Also today, Trump arrived late at the big memorial that was happening at the Arc de Triomphe. He travelled separately from all the other world leaders and turned up late, which seemed to annoy some of the others. He didn't turn up as late as Putin, but Putin seemed a little bit more apologetic for his appearance being late. It just seems somehow Trump always manages to make these things about him, and that was just one of the more notable things about the Armistice memorial over in France. I think it was meant to be a rather routine trip, and Trump managed to turn it into being all about himself.
It was, we had a brilliant service. I did it through my scout group, and the guy's been running it for 30 years, and the turnout we had for such, I'm within London, but essentially it's a village green, and the local people coming out to support it. The turnout we had was very impressive. I know the percentage of scouts who were there. It was a good turnout, because I know as a kid, it's quite hard to convince people that it's worth going to when you were a kid. But, most of them turned up, and then we had a large amount of local people coming out to stand there. We have a pre-service at the Scout Hut that concentrates on local people. And this year, one of the GSL is a teacher, and she'd gone through and done a similar service at school, got all this information on local people, and it was very moving. It's very moving, and I think it's easy. As an adult, obviously, it's easy to get the point of this, but I think the kids still get it. They understand this was, there were people the age of them. There was a nearish to us. There was a 12-year-old who signed up because you didn't have a passport back then. You had a birth certificate, but this kid went and fought in the Somme at the age of 12. And it was only because his mum sent a letter to the War Office saying, this is not okay, here's his birth certificate, that eventually he got sent back home. And then as soon as he got to about 16, he blagged his way in again and went back in 1918. And he survived the war actually, and ended up being a police officer in Kingston. But he's I believe he's noted as the youngest combatant in the World War, at least that we know of. But it's crazy, like, to think, everyone thought it would be over by Christmas. Let's go have a jolly old battle. We'll get a scar, come back and show it off to the ladies. And it very much wasn't what they thought it was going to be. I don't really have a point here. I'm just saying, we should remember this. It is important to remember because we don't want anything like that happening again. And we've developed far more terrifying weapons than we had at the start of that war. I mean, over the course of that war, they went from fighting on horseback at the start of it to machine guns, tanks, planes by the end of it. In fact, it's very interesting. There's on Reddit, I think it's called History Colorized or something like that. It's a subreddit where they recolorize old photos. And there's photos of the French troops at the start of the war, and they look like Napoleonic era troops in like their full color regalia that you can easily see in a forest and shoot at. And obviously by the end of the war, they were in kind of the traditional olive drab kind of colors that we associate now with war. But it's crazy how quickly everything changed in that war, and obviously that led to a terrible death toll. And I would hate to think what a modern war would be like, on that scale, especially with the nukes and things like that people have nowadays.
That's why we do things like we do today, isn't it? It's to remember the horrors of war, almost the consequences, as a reminder.
Yeah,
make sure
exactly.
We don't do it again. We will remember them.
Our final headline, which I suppose leads on into our main point, from the Times: Trump points to second term. So we're 2 years into a Trump presidency, and we've just had the midterm elections. And obviously he's already thinking ahead to 2020 when he'll have to run for re-election. So can you tell us a bit more on that, Rob?
Yeah. You say it's 2 years since Trump's been elected. Boy, hasn't time flown. Don't you just feel it's just, nothing's gone on. It's just been, a breeze. These were the midterm elections, which is going to be our main focus tonight. And this was the first official referendum on Trump since 2016, really. We've talked a bit about how the House works, and this was on the horizon. This was the opportunity for America to vote in the entire House of Representatives again and battle for 1/3 of the Senate seats. If we briefly just go through the results as they stand, it's really important that even though these elections happened Tuesday night, they are still counting ballots in a lot of places, and I think some places in California take up to 2 weeks to count all the ballots. So it'll be a little while until we get the whole picture. But as it stands, the Democrats were able to win the House with 225 seats. With the Republicans winning 225 seats and the Democrats winning 255. That's with 13 seats yet to declare. But in the Senate, however, it was a different picture, and the Republicans were able to maintain their control of the House with 51 seats compared to the Democrats' 46, and there's 3 Senate seats left to declare there.
But I suppose it's worth reminding people that the Senate has 100 seats, so 51 is 51% there. Whereas in the House, that's the 538, right?
Yes, because
that's why 538 is called 538.
Yes, 538 is the Electoral College votes. It might not be.
Oh, okay, right.
Let me just check the number of seats in the House, because the Electoral College votes is the number of senators for each state plus the number of representatives they have in the House for each state. So I think if you have 538 and take away 50, you should get the total in the House. But let me just check. There's 535 seats.
Oh, okay, so it's very close, but not quite.
Yeah, so that's add 50, and then you add an extra 3. Oh, that might be by places by like Washington, D.C., having Electoral College votes as well, even though they're not a state.
Right. Okay.
I think it's oddities like that. But anyway, so yeah, there's 435 seats in the House, and the Democrats currently have 225, and the Republicans have 197.
It's often the case, right, that that at least one of the houses will go to the other side after you've had an incumbent president. I mean, you will probably know more here than me, but I mean, there have been examples where that hasn't happened. But in general, like, it's definitely very rare for them to keep both at this point in the presidency, and that's one of those checks and balances that's in place in the US system. So we were expecting. Well, I mean, I think we were saying last time, was it 6-7 that the House would go to Democrats? So, well, we figured it would be the House, but the Senate was a more interesting race to watch for that reason.
Yeah, the Senate was the opposite. I think the polls really got this election quite right. They said that there was a good chance that Democrats would win the House, and they did. And they said there was a really good chance that Republicans would win the Senate, and that's exactly what's happened. And one of the big talking points was that. Did you hear this term "blue wave" before the election?
Yeah, I did a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, the idea that this would be the moment which would show Trump that everybody thought 2016 was a massive mistake, and that the whole country would sort of swing towards the Democrats. And this is what people were sort of pinning their hopes on, at least in the House elections and in the Senate as well. However, the opinion was that it sort of failed to materialize. Definitely the morning after, I felt that the coverage was, yeah, the Democrats have won, but maybe it's not the body blow, the sort of like the real gut punch to Trump that it could have been. So I just wanted to use this time to examine a couple of the arguments to be made that there was no blue wave, and why the night might be seen as a bad night for Democrats, and then look at the opposite point of view and say why it was a good night for Democrats in the end.
Yeah, I suppose on that point, maybe worth mentioning. So, how late did you stay up on Tuesday watching this?
I didn't stay up. I didn't stay up late. I think I got to bed about midnight that night. I was doing my damnedest to avoid news coverage. Essentially, ever since 2015 and 2016. Where I watched elections and then saw them slowly go bad from my point of view, with the Brexit and Trump ones, I've always felt like I've been a bit of a curse. So I try and think, no, there's no point. Just go to sleep and wake up. So I got about the first hour of coverage, and probably with how bad that was going, or how less good it appeared to be going in that first hour, that encouraged me to go to sleep.
Okay, I mean, I suppose I was in a similar position, except I'm really bad at making myself go to sleep when there's something interesting going on. And I think I mentioned before, I'm on some other Discord servers. There's one which has a lot more Americans on it. So they have a politics channel, and I was in there and I was chatting to people about it, and I kept looking at my watch and the time kept going on. I did go to bed about 2 a.m, after which I think it was pretty certain that they were going to win the House and that they'd lost the Senate. But there was, I suppose the reason I want to mention here is there was the forecast that we'd shared from 538. And it turns out at the start, it was very reactive to the results coming in. So the first, it seemed to be reasonable to start with, and it was going, I think at one point it went to a 19 in 20 chance of the Democrats winning the House, because they had a few early calls for the Democrats. And then at about, it must have been about 12:30, maybe 1 a.m, to us, which would have been, it must have been a much more reasonable time there. But I'm trying to find the tweet to show you. Basically, Nate Silver had to put out a tweet saying, we're going to have to slow down how reactive this is, because it was just taking in every result that came in, taking in the percentage of votes that they knew at the time, and making a prediction based on that almost. So it was just going wildly. And there's one point where it suddenly started predicting the House was not going to go to the Democrats based on very little information. I'll find that tweet and put it in the show notes. But yes, it was interesting following that. And because there was a problem with some of the predictions from 538 in the run up to the Trump victory, and I think he got a lot of flack over that. So there was a lot of people in the Twitter chat, saying, "Oh, it's the same thing again," etc. And it was interesting to watch, but also harrowing at the same time.
Yeah, I think definitely that flashback to 2016 was probably the thing that was making, Democrats jittery. People who were against Trump really jittery. I remember the 538 poll, that graph from 2016, and essentially the prediction, or the polls have predicted that Hillary Clinton had this sort of firewall of blue states that would shield, they're going to lose these states, but if she wins all of these should stay Democrat, which means that even if the Democrats lose Florida, that's no problem. Clinton will probably still have enough to win the election. What happened was Clinton started to lose those states in the firewall, and then the model went, oh goodness, if she's losing this badly here, then we'll have to reinterpret our results, and it went wildly towards Trump. And there's just this graph of it looking all blue at the start of the night and then all red at the end. So I think the model did its job, but its job is to sort of like just take the information it has and translate that, and it had very limited information at the start. I think the two races that were of most interest were there was Kentucky's 6th district. There was one that was a House race that was in quite a red state, but was an indicator that if the Democrats won that, it might be a really good night for them rather than being moderately successful, and they narrowly lost that. And then there was a congressional election in Indiana, so that was in the Senate, where the Democrats were defending a seat, and they ended up losing that to the Republicans. And with all the races that were going on in the Senate, we already talked about this before, but the Democrats are actually defending a large amount of Senate seats, because the last time these elections happened were in 2012, which was, Obama won that election. So it was a fairly high point for the Democrats. A lot of those places had voted red for Trump, and if the Democrats had any chance of making sure that they got a majority in the Senate, then they'd have to keep the ones they already had. And that was lost really early on. So yeah, I think that would have made the polls go bad, and certainly made that sort of like early indicator for Democrats, being that, oh my goodness, this isn't going to be as good as we thought. We're definitely going to lose the Senate. Those sort of dreams were dashed fairly early on in the night. So I can imagine, like you say, that chat room you must have been in, or that Discord server you're on, was probably getting quite jittery at that point.
Yeah, there was. I mean, a number of people said they had to go to bed because they couldn't watch it anymore. It was too stressful. I can understand. I was like, I got to the point where I was like, I feel like this can't. It's not announced one way or the other, but like it looks like it's going the way that we kind of mostly expected. It's time for me to go to bed. So I did. And I was glad when I woke up in the morning to see that it was essentially where we'd got to at that point. Like we thought maybe there'd be more seats in the Senate for the Democrats, but I think it seemed like they were going to win. The Republicans were going to win there in the end. So yeah,
that kind of brings me on to my second point. So those were the results early in the night that made people feel nervous. The second reason why it felt like a bad night for the Democrats was that the really high-profile races in both Florida and Texas went the way of the Republicans. So there was a gubernatorial. Thank you. There was a gubernatorial election in Florida between DeSantis, the Republican candidate, and Gillum. Even as somebody living in the UK, that was the one where I was like looking on Twitter and I saw reactions from their debates going forward. And Florida's always quite a big state to win because it's seen as a key to winning a presidential election. So if you want a barometer of how well you might do in 2020, then being able to win close races in Florida is going to be a big deal. And in the end, both of those elections appear to have gone the way of Republicans. I say appear because at the time of recording, the result is so close that they've had to put in a recount. There's only a gap of 0.2% in the Senate election between Republican Bill Scott and the incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson. This is a race that sort of Trump has tweeted about as well, and there's a lot of confusion about it. I saw a tweet earlier. I'll see if I can find it. Somebody said that news agencies should stop putting that 100% of precincts have reported, because that doesn't necessarily mean that all the votes are in, because that doesn't count mail vote, the votes that come in by the post and absentee ballots, and that can reduce trust in the system if people don't understand quite how it works, and they just think that, oh, the Democrats are just finding votes from somewhere. This is corruption. Trump's been big on, well, he thinks that there's a lot of voter corruption in the USA, even though this has yet to be proved by anybody at any point that it's happening on the scale that Trump claims, but it appears to be one of his big beliefs. And stuff like this happening, if this election was to be recounted and then go the way of Democrats, it would certainly fuel some conspiracy theories, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I've just shared in the chat, and we'll put it in the show notes, there's a link to, well, one of the people I was talking to, they live in New York, and there was the New York Senate 50th district where the news had cut to one of I think it was the Democrat candidate about to give his acceptance speech for winning, but then had to be like, oh, like voice in his ear, oh, hang on, what? And then they cut to the other guy also giving his speech, the Republican, because like it was so close, and it like no one quite knew who'd won yet, and they're still waiting on absentee ballots there. Oh, they may have come through now, but at the time they were waiting on them. So yeah, I mean, it can get stupidly close there. There's only about 2,000 votes between them. Something we don't have. We're all in one time zone in the UK. Hawaii, they are still at the polls when news is coming out of the other places that have closed. Like, so they can do an exit poll as soon as the polls have closed on the East Coast. And by the time you get over to the West, like people could still be voting in the West Coast. And I think that's what happened with Al Gore and George Bush, didn't it? That they think one of the factors may have been that they thought it was going a particular way, and so then people may have changed their vote to try and affect it, or voters who weren't going to go out and vote that day chose to go out and vote. And so when it's a really close race, that can obviously push you over the edge.
As somebody living in the UK, it's hard to even fathom, isn't it, that could happen. The media blackout that happens on election day over here is such that, yeah, I can't quite imagine it on the same scale.
America is big.
Yes. and the other rule is that Florida always goes down to the wire. I mean, Florida could vote on anything, and I think it would be 49 to 51 personally. It's just it always seems to be the case.
Sorry, I was just going to say on Florida, it's interesting. So a lot of things are going on. This isn't just Senate and House elections. That's what we're focusing on. As you've already said, there's gubernatorial votes, but there's also that there's votes on various propositions in the states themselves. And in Florida, one that did go through was allowing people in prison, inmates, to vote in future elections. And apparently it is the thing whenever something happens, people are like, oh, next time that'll swing Florida. So I'm not going to make that prediction because I think everyone else is already saying, oh, that'll massively swing Florida one way or the other. But yes, it's just worth mentioning that got through. And I think overall there was an interesting picture of progressive propositions going through at the state level, but that not necessarily lining up with the votes at the Senate level for the senators, where they might be voting for an incumbent who they trust, for example.
Yeah, you vote for so many things at American elections all at the same time. You can vote on your governor, your senator, your House representative, and these propositions that a lot of people don't bother to vote on all of them. Somebody might just go up and just vote for a senator. So it may be that the more politically active, or the people who feel that they can make a decision on these things, went and voted and got the more progressive measures on the ballot paper through, because they're the ones who'd read up and like, oh, okay, that's I know what this proposition is going to do. I feel if I went to the ballot box and had done no research, I would feel a bit tentative about putting in X about, it might say giving prisoners the vote, but I might not know all the implications of that. I'd want to do more research into it, if that makes sense. So I can understand why you get that split ticket, or the sort of like the juxtaposition in the results in the USA, where even if a Republican is able to carry one area, the Democrats are able to carry another. So yeah, just an interesting aside on that type of voting. The other race I wanted to mention as well for the Democrats that went badly, or at least had some bad optics on it, was the race in Texas. So Beto, somebody's going to correct me on the pronunciation, I know. O'Rourke was the Democratic candidate to go against Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is seen as quite an unpopular figure in the US, and Mr. O'Rourke was seen as a possible presidential candidate, particularly if he was able to carry this race. If the Democrats had been able to win this race, it would have been a massive scalp for them. They would have got Ted Cruz, who's one of the biggest figures in US politics, or at least one of the most recognizable, and they would have made Texas, like ruddy Texas, turn blue. That you just would never have even anticipated that. And even though some of the city areas in Texas are already blue, I know that Austin is an area where the Democrats are already quite strong. Just the impact of turning that blue would have been a real body blow to Trump. O'Rourke also, his campaign got a lot of media coverage, not only for that, but because he had celebrities endorse them. Like I think Beyonce on the day had an Instagram picture of her wearing an O'Rourke cap. It was hyped up a lot in the quote marks liberal media areas of coverage. So when that didn't come in, I think that was also quite a quite a big blow for Democrats' hopes, even though if you had a closer look at the polling, he was always about 2 points behind. Nate Silver's prediction was that he wasn't going to win this race despite all of the effort and despite all of the coverage this race had. So I think it's worth reminding yourself that that victory would have been a shock, but I think so much was invested, so much time was spent on that, so much energy was invested into that result that when it didn't come through, people felt maybe more disappointed than they had a right to be disappointed, if that makes sense.
It's always that perfect point when you hear people saying, oh, well, does my vote matter? And we said last time, go out and vote. That's when a race is this close, you can be like, well, if another 1,000 people or whatever voted on your side would win. That's the perfect case in point of why you should convince people to go vote, or if you're on the fence. And as you say, as a seat that has been consistently Republican, maybe going Democrat is impressive. Admittedly, I have been doing a bit of listening to some other political podcasts in the last week, and I think they kind of describe Texas as a perfect storm. Ted Cruz has monumentally screwed up in like kind of consistently for the last few years, because he was running against Trump, then he was like staunchly against Trump at the convention, I believe. And then afterwards, he's like, oh, actually, maybe I should, as a Republican, support the Republican nominee. So he kind of annoyed everyone who was like pro-Trump. And then he annoyed people who were like, oh, we're not pro-Trump, but we are Republican. He's annoyed a lot of his potential bases. And there are still some repercussions from that, perhaps, going into this race, which, may explain why it was an interesting case. In 4 years' time, he might still be even less popular than he is now. So maybe it's one to watch in 4 years' time.
Sorry, 6 years' time.
Oh, 6 years' time. Yes, sorry. Yeah. there's 2, there's 4, there's
yeah, there's 2, 4, 6. But yeah, it's all too confusing. So those are the two big blows. The final point on why it was a good night for the Republicans, and this might be the most obvious, but it's a bit daft, but it's worth saying, is that the Republicans won the Senate, and the Senate is still, even though it was widely predicted that the Republicans would hold the Senate's still really crucial for power and particularly for Trump. So after Trump is able to say that, hey, we took seats off Democrats in this election in the Senate, which is, yes, true, and you have net gained. A lot of that is due to the fact that this is showing the change since 2012, not the change since 2016. But he could still go and say that, and people will believe him. Two, it gives him good power over some appointments within his own cabinet. So the day after, he fired Jeff Sessions. The moment he knew that he had control in the Senate, he fired Jeff Sessions, basically the guy who had recused himself from the Mueller inquiry, something that annoyed Trump greatly, and he was looking for another one to take up that role. So he got rid of Sessions immediately, and it meant that Trump now has more power in the Senate to make sure that he has senators that would approve his replacement. Also, another factor is that in the Supreme Court, we've just had the very controversial and divisive appointment of Brett Kavanaugh, which has to be, the senators have the final vote in that process. Now you've got people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's the 85-year-old liberal judge, who's a bit of a cult figure. She has a workout video.
She's a badass. Yeah. Yes.
No,
I've seen that. Yeah. She's a complete badass because she has this workout video, and as you say, she's 85 and she's just like pumping iron, basically.
Yeah. She recently broke some ribs. She had a fall and broke ribs, and everybody was like, oh my goodness me, what's going to happen if anything was to happen to her, and then Trump would have the power to effectively appoint 3 Supreme Court judges in 3 years in power. Some presidents can go their whole term, without ever having the opportunity to replace a Supreme Court judge. Trump, who is arguably one of the most conservative presidents we have, could swing the Supreme Court massively in a conservative direction with the help of these senators to approve his pick. And that would have a very long-term effect on US politics because these people are appointed for life. Trump's decisions could have repercussions 20, 30 years in the future. So winning this election was a big deal for Trump. And finally, the people who won in the Senate for Trump, they are senators who are more likely to support Trump than the ones he got rid of. There's no more Jeff Flake. I know that John McCain died before these elections happened, but his replacement in that place is going to be someone that will likely support Trump's ideals more than McCain did. Whereas before he had a 51-49 majority, and almost every vote that went to the Senate, people were going, "Oh, okay, is Flake going to flip? It only takes 2 Republicans to vote against him, and we'll be able to stop Trump." That's exactly what happened when Trump was trying to reform healthcare in the US. He was unable to because his own senators didn't support him. Now, for the next 2 years, he's probably going to have even more support in the Senate than he did. So Trump has some reason to feel successful, and Democrats have, a big reason to feel like that there was a missed opportunity, or they weren't able to completely curtail Trump's power in the midterms.
It is worth mentioning, though, like in the past 2 years, he's got through. I suppose we've not really done a "How has Trump done" kind of episode yet, but we have touched on it at various points. He hasn't got. I mean, he's got through tax cuts, which he was always going to get through with the Republican House and Senate. But he has struggled to get through his other kind of key policies that he put forward. And that was with both houses on side. And now he doesn't have the House. So, he's only got the Senate on his side. So, the House can stop things getting to the Senate approval stage, right, essentially?
Yeah. I think that's why the night was a big win for the Democrats, because they can stop big Trump policies that will now become impossible. Trump can't do any healthcare reforms, really, not on the scale that he wanted to, because the House just won't let him. The Democrats wouldn't let it go through. Equally, funding for the wall. Trump would have to get approval from the House to get that through, and he was unable to with a Republican House and Senate in charge. So Trump having control of the Senate helps him in quite like a narrow corridor of things. Things like the Supreme Court nomination picks, that's something he only needs the Senate to do. Nominating people to his cabinet is something, and the scrutiny of those people is something that the Senate takes a lead on more than the House. So he still has some power, but yeah, Democrats winning the House has massively curtailed Trump's domestic ambitions on a scale that, means that a lot of his policies that he had in 2016 are now virtually impossible. Yeah, that was one of the big points I wanted to add for, why is it a blue wave? Reason for Democrats to be positive. That's the biggest one. The other things I wanted to point towards, some of the odd facts that came out of this election, and saying why it was a blue wave is looking at the popular vote margin between the two parties. So there was, I don't know if you saw this stat, it was in a tweet and I looked it up, and it is true, but it sounds mad when you say it. So the Democrats got 47 million votes and lost 2 seats, and the Republicans got 34 million votes and gained 2 seats.
Wow.
So, so you look at that and you go, how can that be fair? That seems broken. It's worth pointing out that this is only looking at the votes in a third of America, and California had senators in this elected in this sort of round, which means that if California is a very heavily Democrat area, the amount of votes it takes for them to elect one senator is massively disproportionate to how it would be in a smaller state. And we talked in our sort of summer specials on how US politics works, that the Senate is specifically designed to make sure that states have power rather than people. People are represented in the House. That's why the House went to the Democrats. That's why it's fairer in a sense. But still, that number, the number voted for in the Senate and the difference between the seats sort of hides the fact that the Democrats were able to gain a lot of votes in this election. So if the Senate's so unfair to look at, let's look at the House.
Just before you move on there, talking about blue wave and the vote share, I've got a tweet I'm just going to share in the chat and again in the show notes. This is the the historical vote choice in the 18 to 29 bracket, and you can see that since, well, I mean, it's been steadily going up since about 2002, but the youth vote seems to be veering off and becoming much more Democrat than it was in the past, which I suppose mirrors some of the stuff we've said when we've discussed Brexit and other things in the UK Labour vote. But it's interesting that it looks like it is actually a relatively recent phenomenon in the US, whereas I would say that's probably fairly well established in the UK, that there is that age difference in the Labour Conservative vote.
Yeah, it's getting. I think it. I don't know. It may have been there for a while, but I remember when I was studying politics at university, age was briefly mentioned as it was a slight factor, but it's nothing to the degree it is now in elections, particularly since Brexit. I think Brexit was the turning point for the UK, where you see a real divergence in the way that youth groups vote for the different political parties. And I would say that Trump is the real defining factor for historical difference in age turnouts, although you could maybe argue that Obama had a big effect in 2012 when he ran, and in 2008 as well. I think those are where the little spikes are in the map for the Democrats there, that the difference in the age is slowly going up with Obama as well. The biggest factors in these elections, if you wanted to look at what's more likely to make you a Democrat over a Republican, age is one, education is another. There was a big swing of white college-educated people who traditionally would vote for Republicans are now going to the Democratic Party. The white vote, the white college-educated vote, is a big factor and something that is swinging the suburbs of America as well. A lot of these suburban congressional districts went to Democrats, whereas the more rural areas are seeing a big swing towards Trump. Yeah, it's the dividing lines in American politics are becoming less about the actual politics and more about demographics than they ever were before, which seems a bit bizarre, as you know, the politics have never been more different between the two sides.
Kind of a move towards partisan politics in general.
Yes, yeah, precisely. One of the big takeaways that Nate Silver's team had was that partisanship was a bigger factor than incumbency in this election. So usually when you have an incumbent in an election, people say, oh, well, they've done a grand job over the last few years. I'll vote to keep them in. I don't know much about politics, but yeah, sure, I'll keep them in. You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. With the sort of opinion of long-term politicians at the moment, there seems to be almost like an anti-establishment wave going through the world at the moment, or at least in politics. Being an incumbent in some ways is a disadvantage, and people are more likely to try something new or want to have the new option to see if they can change something. So incumbents actually lost on average more during this set of midterms, and if you looked historically at a way a place had voted, then those changes were amplified. So whereas there would be like a very close district in the past, or you would go, this area should be Republican, but they've had a Democratic senator for years, and that's why people keep voting him in, because he's a good senator, and people vote for the incumbent. Those sort of places went Republican this time round because historically they had the demographics to go Republican, and people are voting on those lines rather than on what the actual people are, if that makes sense.
So you also want to talk a bit about gerrymandering, I think.
Before the election, it was reported that Democrats would need a 5% popular vote margin in order to take the House.
Is more than beating, in a first past the post system.
Yeah, if somebody said, "Oh, sorry, you got 0.8% more votes than the other guy, in total, but sorry, that's not enough to get a majority," you'd feel pretty narked. And the reason why the Democrats needed such a big margin only to get a majority is because a lot of districts are gerrymandered. So they crack and pack districts, which basically means they put all of the Democrats in one area and then spread the Republicans out in enough. That's generally what happens. It depends who's in charge. It depends who the governor is, but it tends to be that with more Republican governors in charge at the moment, that the Republicans are the ones with this inbuilt advantage in the electoral system, which means the Democrats need a 5% popular vote margin in order to take a majority. Yeah, those sort of inbuilt advantages for Republicans are in the system, which means it's a lot harder for the Democrats to win victories. So by the Democrats getting about a 7% gain in this election. It means that they won a lot more seats than they got the seats they needed to get a wave. I think if Republicans had got a 7% popular vote margin, then that wave would have been even bigger throughout. So yeah, it's easy to think the Democrats weren't as successful as they could have been because of the advantages that Republicans have in the system.
So we've talked about why wasn't it a blue wave and why was it a blue wave, and tried to show both sides there as much as possible. Talk about, there's a lot of points going into that, and I think probably maybe the most interesting one is the one about the popular vote, especially when we project forwards as per the headline we used. What does this mean for 2020? What can they get rid of Trump after one term, which obviously is what the Democrats would want to happen. I mean, I don't even know how common that is in US politics to have a one-term president. Presumably you have to be pretty bad for that to happen.
Yeah, you do, or you have to be on the, George W. Bush Sr. was a one-term president, but he was coming after 8 years of Republican governorship, of leadership before them in Reagan. So it tends to go like, political parties tend to have about 8 to 12 years in power before they switch. For a political party to have just 4 years in power before it switches back would be really rare. So Trump would hope that he would be able to get re-elected. The nation seems really partisan at the moment, which means that as people become more entrenched, it becomes more and more unlikely that a candidate will emerge that will be able to reach across the divide and get a sort of a clean sweep and say, no, I'm the central candidate. I'm somebody who, both Democrats and Republicans will feel happy voting for. Neither of the political parties is in that place where they can get that type of candidate to a leadership role, which sort of reduces the Democrats' chances of winning the House. It means that Republicans are going to double down on Republicans. States that are red are probably still going to stay really, really red. So it reduces that chance, but it doesn't mean the Democrats can't win. It just might worry them in close electoral college races. As I pointed to before, Florida's really important to win. If Democrats can't win Florida now at a senator level or a governor level, then that puts some doubts into how successful they'll be come a general election in 2020. Maybe the biggest point to take home from this is that the way it usually goes, the way that American politics usually goes is that, and I'll use Obama as a textbook example. Obama won in 2008 big. He won the House and the Senate and had full control of American politics for 2 years. And in that time, he put in Obamacare and Medicare, which was one of the biggest changes in American politics. There was a backlash about that from the Republicans, and they won big in 2010, which meant that Obama was forced to become, more conciliatory, have more compromises about what he could get through the House and what he couldn't. But in the end, Obama won in 2012 quite comfortably. Even though there was a Republican wave in 2010, there was no problem for Obama because he was able to compromise. With Trump, I'm really not sure if he is capable of compromise.
I'm not even sure he knows the word.
Possibly. He wasn't even able to compromise with some of his own senators within his party. We've talked about that a lot in the past, and in his press conference after the midterm election results, he said that he'd be willing to compromise, but if the Democrats started to play hardball, then, he would play hardball too. So if the working of government just grinds to a halt in the next 2 years and Trump can do nothing, that might have a big impact on 2020 and how possible that is. So, yeah, if Trump was a typical president, I would say that he would still have a fairly good chance of winning in 2020. But as past form has shown us, Trump is anything but typical.
I think maybe I'll just add 2 notes based on my kind of listening and reading around the subject in the last week or so. One thing is Trump still has a fairly strong base, which I think people always, going into 2016, people were like, he has this good base, but they always thought that Hillary could beat that. So there's that group of people who are probably always going to vote Trump, that he's managed to mobilize, and he seems to be doing well doing these rallies. And that leads into another point about the Senate. It seems like he concentrated on flying to all the Senate places. I mean, he said that basically the only people who got through were the people who embraced him in the Senate races. So I mean, he clearly thinks he's a big deal in that respect, but it does seem like there is some truth to that. He kind of, maybe he decided he'd give up on the House because he's probably going to lose it, and he was concentrating more on those Senate races. In the general election, he has more time to go around and be visiting all those places in the lead up. So maybe if he concentrates on those swing seats, that he can go and he can boost his base and he can win, because when he holds those rallies, it seems to bring out more people for him.
Yeah, that's sort of the partisan point I was bringing up. If you go into those red states and Trump campaigns there, he's really likely to do it. He's not going to go and campaign in California. It would be a waste of his time.
Yes, yeah.
That base is always really important. That's probably why Trump is never going to lose in a landslide. He's not going to have that happen. That's probably what he's guaranteed himself. The big question remains is that when you go to bellwether states, when you go to places that are close or on the fence about Trump, are they really going to go for Trump in 2020 or not? I think what it means is, unfortunately, I don't think election night 2020 we're going to be going into it thinking, oh, this is going to be a breeze. Trump's definitely going to lose. Whatever happens, it's going to be really, really close. And it's going to come down to a very small number of states.
And we will be there to discuss it afterwards.
Yes.
So I suppose quickly we want to move on to our quick polls update. I know we haven't talked much about the UK this week, but maybe have a quick look and see where things are going.
Let's have a look at that quickly.
It's interesting if you look at the overall graph, actually, while you're bringing up the more recent results. It looks like Labour has been on a downward trend since June 2017. Like their overall trend, they're just going down. And you see the Lib Dem base just kind of coming up, the Greens coming up a bit, and the Conservatives coming up a bit in the last month or two. UKIP have had a few jumps and then seem to be dropping down again. So it's just kind of interesting to pay attention to, I suppose.
Yeah, there's like a recent Survation poll that came out that put Labour ahead by one, which, may show that time is slowly running out for Theresa May. I feel that the Jo Johnson resignation that we touched on earlier was a good old-fashioned traditional sort of politics resignation of I don't agree with the way this country is going, and really set a marker for Theresa May that she's losing. But to lose a Remainer in Johnson, and when she's already lost Leavers like Davis and Boris Johnson, is a worry. If she can't keep those two sides, those are the two sides that she's trying to keep together. And if neither are signing up to her plan, as soon as they lose confidence in that, then I think people are more likely to turn to Labour for a solution.
But I was going to say, but equally, we've had 11 polls since the 1st of October. One was a tie, so let's, for the second, throw that away. You've got two with Labour ahead of one, and all the rest are Conservative ahead. And only one of those was Conservative only ahead by one. So it looks like the Conservatives have held quite strongly through October.
Yes, and it's been the pattern, as you said, since last June, that the Conservatives have sort of held their lead over Labour for a time. I keep saying it every time, but the Brexit negotiations will be the deciding factor for May. I can't remember if I said this last time, so stop me if I did, but there was a columnist who said that when they read about Theresa May, like things change so quickly that one day they think that the government could collapse by the end of the day, and the other times they think that Theresa May will be in her 96th year of government, still negotiating with the European Union. Like those appear to be the only two options on the table. It's a really odd scenario we find ourselves in British politics, and would you say it's almost like a purgatory of just like not quite knowing? I kind of wish the Article 50 date would just happen now, because at least it would spark something.
I think this kind of goes into like our discussion earlier where we were talking about staying up late to watch the results, and kind of you don't know the actual answer yet. You're going back and forth between like worst case and best case scenarios. And I don't know, I feel like I've had a lot of personal stress in the last few weeks moving house and things like that. And a lot of it boils down to not knowing is the most stressful thing. Humans are good at seeing patterns and extrapolating from patterns. But if the pattern keeps changing, then your extrapolation keeps changing, and it's very stressful. And we're doing that as a country right now. It's not just like individual things. It's like, and I think that's why we get this kind of Brexit fatigue. Everyone's kind of like if I keep paying too much attention to this, I will just get too stressed out and not be able to function.
Yeah, no, my usual solution of just going to sleep and waking up to see what happens in the morning hasn't really worked because, I can't hibernate for 3 years. So, much I wish I could.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Oh,
So
excellent.
Glad to end on a high. No, glad to end on a high note.
We love ending on a high note here as we discuss the state of the nation. Thanks for joining me as always, Rob. It's been good to chat about the midterms and maybe getting some opinions I hadn't heard because I've been I suppose I've been paying attention to very US focused things and more kind of local stuff. So it's nice to kind of discuss the big picture. Thank you for joining me as always. We've been on Parliamentary Language. You can find us on all the usual places. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Unparl Podcast. And you can support all of the TTSS Productions shows at patreon.com/TTSS, where you can help fund the website and just throw some money our way to keep us doing these shows. That's always good. And of course, it always helps us if you go onto Apple Podcasts or whatever your app of choice is and write a review, give us 5 stars. They were great. That helps people find the podcast. So that's good too. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him. Bye.
Bye.
Maybe we can add that to the extras if I just, have a little bit of, what are you going to do with all that junk inside that trunk? I'm going to get you drunk, get you love drunk on these humps. My hump, 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 my lovely lady lumps. Check them out. So that was what I was doing for my time.